The threat of full-blown nuclear war hung over the heads of humanity for generations. In fact, the Cold War was defined by the potential fallout of mutually assured destruction between the U.S. and former Soviet Union. And that nuclear arms race dominated world policy throughout the 20th century, beginning with the U.S. showing the world how it had developed the most powerful and destructive weapon on Earth. It's been almost 70 years since the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on the densely populated Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, marking the first and last time in history that a country had ever used nuclear weapons against a civilian population. In Hiroshima, 80,000 people were incinerated instantaneously. In Nagasaki, another 80,000 perished from the blast. Those who survived suffered catastrophic burns. Countless thousands died in the days and weeks following, from the fires that burned down the city to starvation, thirst, to being forced to drink black rain that comprised of radioactive soot from the ashy sky. Tens of thousands more died a slow death from an invisible poison, radiation. Worse still, countless people rushed to the blast zones to help with rescue and cleanup missions, not knowing about the deadly effects of radiation. Instead, they were treated like lab rats. The myth that the U.S. needed to drop nuclear weapons to end the war and, quote, save lives remains one of the biggest institutionalized falsehoods in American society. Whenever you bring up the issue, the common responses you hear are hypotheticals like millions more would have died. It forced the Japanese to surrender along with the debased, but what about Pearl Harbor? Unfortunately, hypotheticals are hardly legitimate to rationalize mass atrocities. So let's put this into perspective and address one of the biggest myths. The first piece of conventional wisdom that must be understood is that the U.S. baited Japan into war. The Roosevelt administration had imposed harsh economic sanctions on Japan. According to Robert Higgs at the Independent Institute, Roosevelt and his subordinates knew that they were putting Japan in an untenable position, and that the Japanese government might well try to escape the stranglehold by going to war. Having broken the Japanese diplomatic code, the Americans knew what Foreign Minister Taijiro Toyoda had communicated to Ambassador Kichisa Buro Nomura on July 31st. Commercial and economic relations between Japan and third countries, led by England and the U.S., are gradually becoming so horribly strained that we cannot endure it much longer. Consequently, our empire, to save its very life, must take measures to secure the raw materials of the South Seas. According to Higgs, U.S. cryptographers had also broken the Japanese naval code, showing that one of Japan's measures would include an attack on Pearl Harbor. That aside, Pearl Harbor was a horrible tragedy where nearly 3,000 Americans lost their lives. But the U.S. government seized the event, like it always does, and used it as an opportunity to engage in imperial bloodlust. Of course, the Japanese empire engaged in mass atrocity of its own against the Chinese. The rape of Nanking alone amounted to the murder of as many as 300,000 civilians, where Japanese soldiers were documented as committing such horrific acts as impaling babies on swords. But that was not the reason why nuclear bombs were dropped. See, the U.S. had already firebombed Tokyo, dropping 2,000 tons of incendiary bombs on the city. Within just 2 days, most of the area was burned, and up to 130,000 civilians, were massacred in what is known as the worst firestorm in recorded history. At that point, Japan was so crippled, it was ready to surrender. In fact, the University of Colorado features a compilation of American military leaders by way of internal interviews, diaries, and other declassified materials involved in the bomb decision. And there's one astounding commonality among them. Every single military official states that the bombs were not dictated by a military necessity. Furthermore, in 1946, the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey Group, assigned by Truman himself to study the attacks, determined, based on a detailed investigation, Japan would have surrendered even if the atomic bombs had not been dropped, even if Russia had not entered the war, and even if no invasion had been planned or contemplated. But despite the words from the horse's mouth, people will hang on to the myth because it's easier to believe that America's right and just and didn't commit one of the biggest acts of terrorism and psychological warfare in the 20th century without there being some reason. No one wants to face the real truth. It was to assert America's military might and its role on the global stage. Of course, what followed was decades of nuclear buildup. In retrospect, the atomic bomb seems like piecemeal, considering how right now we have the hydrogen bomb, a weapon with 3,300 times the force than that dropped on Hiroshima. Yes, humanity seems to have a death wish for itself and the planet. In 2009, Obama won a Nobel Peace Prize in part for his role in nuclear disarmament, when he was espousing rhetoric like this.
I state clearly and with conviction America's commitment to seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons.
However, over the next 30 years, the U.S. is set to spend $1 trillion modernizing its nuclear facilities. Unfortunately, Russia and the U.S. still have around 8,000 nuclear warheads in their arsenal, respectively, and 7 other countries continue to build up theirs. Meanwhile, absurd justifications for continuing to maintain such an outrageous amount of nukes subsist. A recent Government Accountability Office report cites that some nuclear warheads set to be dismantled are now being kept whole in order to combat asteroids. Yes, asteroids. So as the world moves on from one Cold War to resurrect another, while treaties are left unratified and as the U.S. government continues to arbitrate foreign policy based on the containment of other states' nuclear development, we're reminded of the blatant truth that remains so hard to hear for so many. America is the only country that has ever actually used nuclear weapons when it didn't have to. And until we face this dark truth and start valuing life over death and destruction, we're doomed to repeat the most horrifying mistakes of our past.